The air in courtroom 4B was thick with a silence that felt heavier than sound. On one side sat Daniel Peterson, a titan of industry, his arm draped possessively around his young, beautiful mistress, Amber Calloway. They whispered and smirked, radiating a confidence that bordered on contempt. On the other side sat Jessica Peterson, Daniel's wife of 22 years. She wore a simple grey dress, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She hadn't spoken a word, not to her lawyer, not to the bailiff, not to anyone. Her silence was a strange, unnerving vacuum in the room. Daniel saw a woman defeated a ghost, already fading from his vibrant new life. But he was wrong. Her silence wasn't an admission of defeat. It was the calm before a storm she had spent a year meticulously planning, and in her briefcase lay a single forgotten document that was about to turn this polished courtroom into a theater of ruin. The fluorescent lights of the Franklin County Courthouse hummed a monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of emotions playing out within its walls. To any casual observer, the scene in Judge Mariah Franklin's courtroom was a depressingly common one, a high-stakes divorce between a wealthy, powerful man and the wife he was leaving for a younger woman. Daniel Peterson at 48 was the picture of success. His suit was a custom-tailored Zegna, his watch a Patek Philippe that cost more than most people's cars, and his smile was a weapon he'd sharpened over years of corporate takeovers. He was the founder and CEO of Peterson Development Group, a real estate empire that had reshaped the city's skyline. Beside him, Amber Calloway clung to his arm. At 26, she was all vibrant youth and expensive maintenance, perfectly straightened blonde hair, lips plumped with filler, and a diamond necklace, a recent gift from Daniel that sparkled cruelly under the sterile lighting. She looked at Jessica with a poorly concealed pity, the kind of look a victor gives to the vanquished. Then there was Jessica. At 47, she looked her age, and she wore it with a quiet dignity that seemed to infuriate her husband more than any outburst could. There were no tears, no trembling hands, no desperate glances. Her face was a placid lake, betraying none of the turbulent currents beneath. Her lawyer, David Chen, a sharp and observant man in his late 50s, would occasionally lean in to whisper something, and she would simply nod her eyes, fixed on the judge's empty chair. This stoicism was new. For the first few months after she discovered the affair, Jessica had been a wreck. She'd found the evidence in the most cliché of ways, a series of explicit texts on Daniel's iPad, which he'd carelessly left at home. The messages between him and Amber weren't just about physical encounters. They were filled with mockery directed at her. They called her the Foundation, a cold, boring necessity upon which Daniel had built his palace, but which would soon be bulldozed to make way for a more beautiful modern structure. They laughed about her practical wardrobe, her preference for reading over attending galas, and her complete lack of ambition. The words had shattered her more than the images of their liaisons. For 22 years, her lack of ambition had been the bedrock of his success. She was the one who managed their home, their finances, their son Kevin's entire life, so Daniel could be the visionary, the risk-taker. She handled the mundane, so he could be magnificent. She was the one who stayed up all night with him, poring over blueprints and business plans in their small apartment when all they had was a dream. She had been his partner in every sense of the word, the silent, uncredited co-author of his success story. The discovery had sent her into a spiral of grief. She lost weight. She cried until her eyes were raw. She confronted Daniel, who didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "Jess, come on," he'd said, sighing as if she were a business deal that had gone sour. "We haven't really been a team for years. We grew apart. It happens." Amber, she understands the man I am now. You're still living in the past." He offered her a generous settlement, a clean break. He would keep the company the main house and his portfolio. She could have the vacation condo in Florida, a lump sum of a few $1 million and alimony. It was enough to live comfortably, but it was a pittance compared to the nearly billion-dollar empire they had built together. It was a severance package for a long-term employee, not a fair division for a wife and partner. That was the moment the tears stopped. The raw, gut-wrenching pain crystallized into something cold-hard and incredibly clear. She saw him for what he was, a man who had not just betrayed their vows, but had actively rewritten their shared history to erase her role in it entirely. He didn't just want a divorce, he wanted to invalidate her entire life's work. She hired David Chen, a lawyer, known not for his courtroom theatrics, but for his meticulous, almost surgical approach to corporate and family law. At their first meeting, she was still fragile, but a flicker of resolve was there. "He thinks I'm a fool, Mr. Chen," she had said, her voice quiet but steady. "He thinks I'm the simple housewife he's been telling everyone I am. He's forgotten who I was before I was Mrs. Peterson." She then told him a story that went back more than 2 decades to a time before Peterson Development Group, before the skyscrapers and the private jets. A story about a young woman with a surprising inheritance and a shrewd, loving grandfather who had seen the ambition in Daniel Peterson long before she did, and had recognized the potential danger in it too. For the next year, Jessica followed a disciplined routine. She agreed to mediation sessions, where she remained mostly silent, letting Daniel's arrogant lawyers dictate the terms, all of which she politely refused through Mr. Chen. She let Daniel and Amber flaunt their relationship, enduring the humiliation of seeing them in newspapers and on society blogs. The whispers followed her through the grocery store, and at the country club she no longer felt welcome in. "Poor Jessica," they'd say. She let herself go. No wonder he left her. She absorbed it all, the pain, the pity, the condescension. She transformed it into fuel. While Daniel was celebrating his new life, Jessica was in Mr. Chen's office, or in the county archives, or on the phone, with financial analysts patiently gathering the threads of a past Daniel had long since forgotten. Her silence was not weakness. It was the sound of a trap being meticulously set. Frank Miller, Daniel Peterson's lead attorney, strode through the courthouse hallway with the unshakable confidence of a man who billed $1,000 an hour and had never lost a case that truly mattered. He was tall, silver-haired, with a tan that spoke of weekend yachting trips, not hours under fluorescent lights. He clapped Daniel on the shoulder, a gesture of masculine solidarity. "Don't you worry about a thing, Dan," Frank said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. "This is textbook. She's in the anger and denial phase. Her silence in there, it's a classic intimidation tactic from a weak position. She's got nothing, and her lawyer knows it. We'll be out of here by lunch." Daniel nodded, a smirk playing on his lips as he glanced back into the courtroom at Jessica. "She looks like a frightened mouse," he whispered to Amber, who giggled and squeezed his arm tighter. "Always was. I built an empire, and she organized the pantry. There's no comparison." In Daniel's mind, this was an open and shut case. His narrative was simple, and he believed irrefutable. He was the visionary, the genius who had turned a small construction loan into a multi-billion-dollar behemoth. Jessica was his supportive wife, a homemaker who had enjoyed the fruits of his labor. The law was clear on marital assets, and his offer of $5 million plus the condo was, in his and Frank's opinion, exceedingly generous. It was certainly more than any judge would award a non-contributing spouse. The key, Frank had explained in their last strategy meeting, is to frame her role correctly. We celebrate her as a mother and a wife, of course, but we firmly establish that she had zero involvement in the business. No input on deals, no financial contributions, no strategic insights. She was the CEO of the home, not the boardroom. The judge will see the distinction. Daniel had readily supplied a list of evidence. He pointed to decades of board meeting minutes where Jessica's name never appeared. He had affidavits from business partners who had only ever met her at Christmas parties. He emphasized that her college degree was in art history, hardly a qualification for real estate development. Amber, meanwhile, was living in the future Daniel had painted for her. She had already picked out the new furniture for the main house, a sprawling 15,000-square-foot mansion that Jessica had painstakingly designed and decorated. She'd spent hours on luxury websites, curating wish lists for their new life together. Daniel had promised her everything: a wedding in Lake Como, a position as the head of the new Peterson Charitable Foundation, a vanity project with a corner office and a significant budget. He had made her believe that she was stepping into a role that Jessica was too small, too simple to ever truly fill. "It's just a formality, baby," Daniel reassured her as they sat waiting for the judge. "Once this is over, we can finally announce our engagement. No more hiding. We'll get that ring you wanted this weekend." Amber beamed. The ring was a flawless 8-carat canary diamond they had seen at a private jeweler. Its price tag was more than the annual salary of most CEOs. It was a symbol to her of her victory. Daniel's arrogance was a fortress, built brick by brick over 2 decades of success. Every deal he closed, every building that rose under his name, every fawning magazine profile had reinforced his belief in his own singular genius. He had long ago convinced himself that he had done it all alone. Jessica's early contributions, her emotional support, the sacrifices she made, they had all faded from his memory, edited out of the official history he told himself and the world. He remembered their early days, of course, but he remembered them differently now. He saw his younger self as a struggling genius, and Jessica as the lucky woman he had chosen to accompany him on his meteoric rise. He'd forgotten the nights she'd spent co-signing loan applications with her perfect credit score when his was still a wreck. He'd forgotten that it was her idea to pivot from residential flips to commercial development, a move that had quadrupled their net worth in 2 years. He'd forgotten that her father had been a successful contractor and that she'd grown up reading blueprints at the dinner table. He had conveniently and completely forgotten. Frank Miller felt the same confidence. He'd deposed Jessica a few weeks prior. She had been polite quiet, and her answers were brief. "Mrs. Peterson, did you ever attend a board meeting of the Peterson Development Group?" Frank had asked. "No," Jessica replied. "Did you ever directly negotiate a land acquisition deal?" "No." "Did you have any professional role, paid or unpaid, within the corporate structure?" "No." It was perfect. She was admitting to it all. Frank had ended the deposition, feeling utterly triumphant. David Chen had just sat there, making notes, a small, unreadable smile on his face. Frank had dismissed it as the false bravado of a lawyer who knew he was outgunned. The man had brought a knife to a missile fight, so as they sat in the courtroom, the team of Daniel, Amber, and Frank was a picture of relaxed, inevitable victory. They saw the proceedings not as a battle, but as a coronation of their new reality. They saw Jessica's silence as the white flag of surrender. They had no idea it was the silent, patient countdown of a bomb. To understand the document that lay waiting in David Chen's briefcase, one had to go back 23 years to a dusty lawyer's office in a much smaller town, and to a man named William Bill Irvine. Bill was Jessica's maternal grandfather, a man forged from Depression-era hardship and post-war pragmatism. He wasn't flashy. He'd built a successful regional construction company through handshake deals, an obsession with quality, and an uncanny ability to read people. He wore flannel shirts, drove a Ford pickup until the doors rusted, and believed that a person's character was revealed not in their words, but in their balance sheet and their treatment of subordinates. He adored Jessica, his only grandchild. He had taught her how to read a surveyor's map, how to estimate lumber costs, and most importantly, how to see the foundation of a thing, be it a building or a person's ambition. When Jessica brought Daniel home for the first time, Bill was polite but quietly observant. Daniel was charming, handsome, and full of intoxicating dreams. He spoke of towers and empires, of changing the face of the city. Jessica, who was deeply in love, was swept away by his vision. Bill saw something else. He saw an ambition so vast it bordered on avarice. He saw a young man who was in love with Jessica, yes, but who was also in love with the idea of what she could help him become. A year later, Bill passed away, leaving Jessica his entire estate. It wasn't a staggering fortune by today's standards, but for a 24-year-old in the early 2000s, it was a life-changing sum, just over $850,000 in cash and stocks, the liquidated value of his life's work. Daniel was ecstatic. "This is it, Jess," he'd exclaimed, spreading blueprints across their tiny apartment floor. "This is the seed money. This is what launches everything. We can bypass the banks, the skeptical investors. We can do it our way." Jessica, eager to prove her faith in him, was ready to sign the entire amount over to him to start his company. But there was a condition in Bill's will, a final piece of grandfatherly protection. His lawyer, a man as old and methodical as Bill himself, explained it to her. The inheritance could only be accessed through a specially structured trust. Bill was very specific, Jessica, the lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, had said, peering at her over his spectacles. He wanted to ensure your future was always secure, no matter what. And so the Irvine Legacy Trust was born. It was a complex legal instrument designed by a man who understood both construction and deconstruction. Jessica was the sole beneficiary. Daniel, at her direction, would be named the managing trustee, giving him the power to invest and use the funds to build his business. He could draw a salary, reinvest profits, and operate with significant freedom. On the surface, it gave Daniel everything he wanted, but buried deep in the trust's boilerplate were two clauses written in dense legalese that were pure, unadulterated Bill Irvine. The first was the seed fruit clause. It stipulated that the initial capital from the trust, the $850,000, was legally considered the seed of any and all business ventures it funded. Therefore, the trust itself, not Daniel Peterson, personally would perpetually hold a 51% controlling interest in the primary fruit of that seed, which was the initial company, Peterson Homes, LLC. This controlling interest would automatically extend to any subsequent holding companies, parent corporations or entities that grew from the assets or profits of the original company. For 23 years, Daniel had operated under the assumption that he owned 100% of his empire. He had forgotten that the first pot of soil he'd planted in was never truly his. The second clause was even more personal. It was a moral turpitude and fiduciary duty clause. Bill had seen the fire in Daniel, but also the potential for it to burn out of control. The clause stated that if the managing trustee Daniel were to commit any act that could be legally defined as bringing disrepute to the family name, or if he failed in his fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of the sole beneficiary, Jessica, which included the act of marital infidelity leading to a divorce, then his role as managing trustee would be immediately terminated. Furthermore, upon termination, All operational control and voting rights of the trust's 51% stake would revert entirely and irrevocably to the beneficiary. When the trust was signed, Daniel had barely skimmed the document. He was a young man in a hurry, blinded by the sudden windfall. The clauses seemed like archaic legal nonsense, the ramblings of an overprotective old man. He signed it, took the money, and launched his company. The original trust document was filed away, a copy given to Jessica, who stored it in a safe deposit box, along with her grandfather's other papers. For 22 years it lay dormant. Daniel's company morphed from Peterson Homes, LLC, to the Peterson Development Group. The initial $850,000 grew into a billion-dollar empire. He conducted business-issued stock in the new company, never the original LLC, which still technically existed as a holding shell, and had built his kingdom, all while believing it was his and his alone. He had forgotten the foundation. He had forgotten that he was merely the manager of a house that Jessica, through her grandfather's ghost, had always owned. When Jessica's world collapsed and the grief subsided, the memory of that dusty office and Mr. Abernathy's words came flooding back. She went to the bank, her hands trembling as she unlocked the deposit box. There it was in a faded manila envelope, the W. Irvine Legacy Trust. She read it once then, twice her heart pounding. The dense legal language that had confused her as a young woman was now crystal clear. The seed fruit clause, the moral turpitude clause. It was all there. Her grandfather from his grave had handed her a weapon of unimaginable power. He had seen the future, and he had built his granddaughter a fortress. This was the secret she shared with David Chen. This was the source of her unnerving calm. She wasn't fighting for a scrap of her husband's fortune. She was preparing to claim the kingdom he had only ever been managing on her behalf. Judge Mariah Franklin entered the courtroom, a formidable presence in her black robes. She was in her early 60s, with a reputation for being whip-smart and having a low tolerance for theatrics. "Be seated," she commanded, and the room fell silent. She reviewed the docket, her eyes scanning the names. "We are here for the divorce proceedings of Peterson versus Peterson. Mr. Miller, I believe you have an opening statement and a proposed settlement." Frank Miller rose smoothly to his feet, a portrait of polished confidence. "Thank you, Your Honor. We are indeed here today to dissolve the marriage between my client, Mr. Daniel Peterson, and Mrs. Jessica Peterson. This is a sad occasion, the end of a long union. But Mr. Peterson is committed to ensuring his former wife is well taken care of as she transitions to her new life." He paced slowly before the judge's bench, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. "Mr. Peterson is the sole architect of the Peterson Development Group, an enterprise he built from the ground up through relentless hard work vision and considerable personal risk. Mrs. Peterson, by her own admission in deposition, played the valuable but non-business role of a homemaker and mother. In recognition of her years of support, Mr. Peterson is making a settlement offer that is frankly unprecedented in its generosity for a non-contributing spouse." He paused for dramatic effect. "Mr. Peterson is prepared to offer Mrs. Peterson a one-time lump sum payment of $7 million. He raised the number from their initial offer, a tactic to appear magnanimous in court. Additionally, she will receive full unencumbered title to their vacation property in Naples, Florida, valued at approximately $2 million. This $9 million settlement is more than sufficient for Mrs. Peterson to live in extreme comfort for the rest of her life. We believe this is not just fair, but extraordinarily generous, and we hope to resolve this matter today." He sat down. Daniel gave him a subtle nod of approval. Amber subtly squeezed Daniel's hand under the table, her mind already calculating a triumphant gleam in her eyes. It was over. All Jessica had to do was accept the pile of money and disappear. Judge Franklin looked over at the other table. "Mr. Chen, your response." David Chen stood. He was the physical opposite of Frank Miller. Shorter, more compact, his suit functional rather than flashy. He radiated a quiet competence. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm and even, "we thank Mr. Miller for his performance, and we respectfully reject his client's offer." A murmur went through the small gallery. Daniel stiffened his brow, furrowing in annoyance. Frank Miller simply looked amused. "On what grounds, Mr. Chen?" the judge asked, her pen poised. "Is your client contesting the valuation of the marital assets?" "No, Your Honor," David said. "We are contesting the ownership." This time the murmur was louder. Frank Miller let out a short, incredulous laugh. Daniel leaned over to him. "What the hell is he talking about? Ownership, I own my company." Judge Franklin banged her gavel lightly. "Order. Explain yourself, Mr. Chen." "Certainly, Your Honor. Mr. Miller is correct that my client was not on the board of the Peterson Development Group. He is correct that she did not negotiate deals in the company's current form. His narrative is meticulously constructed and accurate right up to the point where it begins. But he has started the story in the middle. We would like to start at the beginning." David Chen walked back to his table and picked up a single thick document from his briefcase. It was bound in a faded blue cover, the paper yellowed with age. "Mr. Peterson founded his first company, Peterson Homes, LLC, approximately 23 years ago. Mr. Miller referred to this as being built from the ground up, perhaps with a small business loan. This is inaccurate. The company was not funded by a loan. It was funded in its entirety by a single source, an investment of $850,000. Chen paused, letting the statement hang in the air. He looked directly at Daniel, whose face had gone from annoyed to confused. He was searching his memory, the gears turning. "This capital," Chen continued, his voice dropping slightly, "didn't come from Mr. Peterson. It came from my client, Mrs. Jessica Peterson, as the sole disbursement from an inheritance left to her by her grandfather, Mr. William Irvine." The air in the room shifted. Amber looked at Daniel, a flicker of uncertainty on her face. Daniel's jaw was tight. He remembered the money, of course, but he'd always considered it a gift, a joint investment in their future which had become his success. Frank Miller stood up. "Your Honor, objection. Even if this is true, which we would need to verify, money given at the start of a marriage is a marital asset. It doesn't give Mrs. Peterson ownership of a billion-dollar corporation 23 years later. It's a contribution, and the $9 million offer more than generously repays that initial sum." Judge Franklin looked at Chen. "He has a point, Counselor. Where are you going with this?" David Chen gave the slightest of smiles. It was the same unreadable expression he'd worn at the deposition. "Your Honor, it wasn't a gift. It wasn't a loan. It was an investment governed by a legally binding contract, a contract Mr. Peterson himself signed." He walked forward and placed the blue-bound document on the clerk's desk to be marked as an exhibit. "I present to the court exhibit the founding trust agreement for the W. Irvine Legacy Trust, dated May 14, 2002. Daniel Peterson stared at the document as if it were a snake. The name echoed in the distant vaults of his memory, a piece of old, boring paperwork he'd signed in a rush of youthful ambition, an obstacle between him and the money he needed. He had never thought of it again. Until now. Jessica remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Her expression hadn't changed. She just watched her husband, her eyes devoid of hatred or anger, filled only with a profound, knowing calm. She had known this moment was coming, and she knew what came next. A trust agreement. Judge Franklin's voice was sharp, cutting through the tense atmosphere. She took the document from the clerk, her experienced eyes immediately assessing its age and authenticity. Mr. Miller, were you aware of this document? Frank Miller was on his feet, looking flustered for the first time in his professional life. No, Your Honor. This document was not produced during discovery. With respect, Your Honor, David Chen interjected smoothly. Mr. Miller's discovery requests were for all documents pertaining to the Peterson Development Group. This document predates that entity. It pertains to Peterson Homes, LLC, and the trust that funded it. We have been entirely compliant. It was a masterful piece of lawyering, a technically true statement that had concealed a nuclear bomb. Frank Miller's face flushed with anger. He had been played. Daniel was now leaning forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his table. He was whispering furiously to Frank. It's nothing. It's just some old family thing. Tell them it's irrelevant. Judge Franklin ignored the commotion. She donned a pair of reading glasses and began to silently read the document. The courtroom was so quiet that the rustle of the old paper sounded like a crackling fire. Jessica watched the judge's face, waiting for the flicker of understanding. It took about 3 minutes. The judge's eyebrows rose. She read a passage again, then slowly looked up from the pages over her glasses, first at David Chen, then at a pale Daniel Peterson. Her expression was one of profound legal fascination. Mr. Chen, she said, her voice now laced with a new tone of gravity. Would you care to direct the court to the relevant passages? Gladly, Your Honor, Chen replied. I would first direct you to Article 4, Section B, which we have termed the Seed Fruit Clause. Judge Franklin found the section. Please read it into the record, Mr. Chen. David cleared his throat. The initial capital of this trust hereafter referred to as the seed capital. If invested in a new business enterprise managed by the appointed trustee, shall grant the trust a perpetual, non-dilutable 51% controlling interest in said enterprise. This interest shall automatically extend to any and all successor entities, parent corporations, or holding companies that are a direct financial result of the initial enterprise's growth, profits, or assets. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Frank Miller shot up. Your Honor, that's unenforceable. It's an unconscionable contract. My client would never have knowingly signed away control of his company. He did sign it, didn't he, Mr. Miller? The judge countered her gaze, sharp as flint. She pointed to the last page. The signature here appears to be his. Mr. Peterson, is this your signature? Daniel could only stare, speechless. It was his signature, his own youthful, arrogant scrawl. The judge continued, her voice cold. The document appears to be properly executed and notarized. Unconscionable or not is a matter for another day. For now it is a contract. And it gets worse, doesn't it, Mr. Chen? It does, Your Honor, David said, his voice ringing with quiet power. I would now direct you to Article 6, Section D, the Moral Turpitude and Fiduciary Duty Clause. Amber Calloway, who had been listening with a mounting sense of confusion and dread, now looked completely lost. The legalese was a foreign language, but the tone in the room was unmistakable. Something was terribly wrong. Judge Franklin read the clause to herself first, her lips thinning into a grim line. She then looked directly at Daniel Peterson, her eyes filled with something approaching pity. Mr. Chen, the judge commanded, please read Section D aloud for the court. David Chen's voice was clear and deliberate, each word a hammer blow on the anvil of Daniel's life. The managing trustee in his duties owes an absolute and unwavering fiduciary duty to the sole beneficiary. Should the managing trustee engage in any action constituting moral turpitude, including but not limited to acts of marital infidelity, which result in the dissolution of his marriage to the beneficiary, he shall be considered in fundamental breach of his fiduciary duty. Upon such a breach, the trustees roll all associated salary privileges and operational control shall be immediately and irrevocably terminated. David took a breath before delivering the final devastating sentence. Upon said termination, all voting rights and operational authority over the trust's assets, including its 51% controlling interest in the enterprise and all successor entities, shall revert in their entirety to the sole and exclusive control of the beneficiary, Mrs. Jessica Peterson. Silence. Not the quiet of before. This was a dead, suffocating silence, the kind that follows a massive explosion. Daniel Peterson's carefully constructed world, his empire, his identity. It had all been a mirage. He wasn't the king. He was a manager, a long-term employee who had just been fired by the company's silent majority shareholder. And the grounds for his termination, his affair with the woman sitting right next to him. The full weight of it descended upon him. The smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of slack-jawed horror. His face, usually so tan and vibrant, had turned a pasty, sickly white. He looked at Jessica, truly looked at her for the first time in years. Her calm, silent face was no longer that of a victim. It was the face of the executioner. For a long moment, nobody moved. The words of the trust agreement hung in the air like toxic smoke. Frank Miller stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, the arguments and objections dying in his throat. He was a brilliant lawyer, but he was a surgeon, not a miracle worker. He couldn't resuscitate a patient who had just been decapitated. The first to break the silence was Daniel. It wasn't a roar of outrage or a plea for mercy. It was a strangled, desperate whisper. No, that can't be real. It's a trick. He turned to Jessica, his eyes wild with panic. Jess, what is this? What did you do? Jessica finally broke her silence. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room with the precision of a scalpel. I didn't do anything, Daniel Stahur, she said, her tone devoid of emotion. You did. You signed the papers. You built the company with my grandfather's money under his terms, and you violated the contract. Her use of the word contract instead of vows was devastating. It stripped away all pretense of their marriage and laid bare the cold business reality of his transgression. Judge Franklin cleared her throat, bringing the focus back to her. The implications of this document are, to say the least, staggering. Based on a preliminary reading, it appears that the controlling interest of the Peterson Development Group is and has always been an asset of the W. Irvine Legacy Trust. And it appears that operational control of that trust now reverts to Mrs. Peterson. The marital assets are not what we thought they were. She looked at Daniel. It would seem, Mr. Peterson, that most of the assets you believed were yours to divide are in fact not yours at all. This was the tipping point. The legal implications were one thing, but the public personal humiliation was another. But the final blow wasn't aimed at Daniel. It was aimed at Amber. Amber Calloway had been watching this unfold like a tennis match, her head swiveling from the lawyers to the judge to Daniel. The color had been draining from her face as the reality of the situation slowly dawned on her. The money, the house, the foundation, the status. It was all tied to Daniel's ownership of the company. She still clung to a sliver of hope, the hope of a woman who believes in the power of the man she loves. She turned to Daniel, her voice a frightened whisper. Danny, what does this mean? Tell me what this means. Before Daniel could answer, Judge Franklin spoke her voice, leaving no room for illusion. She looked at Amber not unkindly, but with a frankness that was brutal in its clarity. "It means Ms. Calloway." The judge said that the life Mr. Peterson promised you was built on a foundation he didn't own. The fortune he used to charm you, the houses he offered you, the very company that gives him his name, according to this document, more than half of it has always belonged to Mrs. Peterson. The judge then delivered the fatal strike. She looked back down at the trust document. "And it also means that any promises he made to you about your financial future were promises made with assets that were never his to give away." That was the sentence that shattered Amber Calloway. It wasn't just about the money. It was the complete and utter annihilation of her reality. She wasn't the beautiful young woman who had captured the heart of a powerful king. She was the foolish girl who had been seduced by a court jester, a man who had been wearing a borrowed crown the entire time. The canary diamond on her neck suddenly felt like a cheap piece of glass. The smirks she had shared with Daniel, the pitying looks she had given Jessica, it all came rushing back to her, recast in a new, horrifying light of her own gullibility. She hadn't won. She had been a pawn in a game she never even knew was being played, the very instrument of her supposed lover's self-destruction. Her breath hitched. A low, guttural sound escaped her throat, a mix of a sob and a gasp. Her perfectly made-up face contorted in a mask of pure agony. The world she had so confidently planned to step into had just evaporated into thin air, revealing a gaping abyss beneath her feet. "No," she whimpered, shaking her head. "No, he promised." Her eyes rolled back in her head. Her body went limp, and she slid sideways off her chair, collapsing onto the courtroom floor in a heap of designer fabric and shattered dreams. Chaos erupted. The bailiff rushed forward. "Code blue in courtroom 4B, he shouted into his radio. Frank Miller scrambled to help her, while Daniel just stared at her crumpled form on the floor, his mind finally completely broken by the scale of his ruin. And through it all, Jessica Peterson sat perfectly still. She didn't look at Amber on the floor. She didn't look at her husband's horrified face. She just looked straight ahead at the judge, her expression unchanged. Her quiet, dignified silence had finally been understood. It was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of victory. The sight of Amber Calloway being attended to by paramedics effectively ended the day's proceedings. Judge Franklin adjourned the court, setting a new date to deal with the monumental fallout of the trust document. The courtroom cleared out in a buzz of shocked whispers, leaving a scene of carnage in its wake. Daniel Peterson was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, muttering to a shell-shocked Frank Miller, who could only offer platitudes about appeals and challenges that they both knew were futile. Jessica stood up, collected her purse, and gave a brief, polite nod to her lawyer, David Chen. "I will call you tomorrow, Mr. Chen," she said calmly. "An excellent day's work, Mrs. Peterson." He replied, a deep respect in his voice. She walked out of the courtroom alone. The hallway which she had entered, feeling the weight of condescending stares, now parted for her. People looked at her differently, with awe, with fear, with a newfound respect. She didn't acknowledge them. Her face wasn't gloating or triumphant. It was simply serene. She had not come here for revenge. She had come for reclamation. The weeks that followed were a legal whirlwind, but the outcome was never in doubt. The W. Irvine Legacy Trust was ironclad. Daniel's legal challenges were dismissed one by one. He was forced to step down as CEO of the company he had built, handing the reins over to a transitional board appointed by the trust's new sole controller, Jessica. He lost the mansion, the cars, the accounts, and the jet. Everything that had been purchased under the corporate umbrella now belonged to the corporation he no longer controlled. He was left with a personal checking account containing a few $100,000 and a portfolio of stocks he had acquired, separate from the company, a fraction of his former worth. He also had Amber, who after being discharged from the hospital had a screaming match with him in the lobby of the hotel he was now forced to live in. Their relationship, built on a currency of power and wealth, could not survive the sudden bankruptcy of both. She left, taking the Canary Diamond with her, the only thing she managed to salvage from the wreckage. Jessica, however, did not liquidate the company. She did not fire all the employees. She did not erase Daniel's legacy out of spite. That was never her intention. Her grandfather had been a builder, not a demolisher. She stepped into the role of chairperson of the board. Her art history degree, which Daniel had so often mocked, had given her a keen eye for design, structure, and history. Her years managing a complex household and their personal finances had made her a formidable administrator, and her quiet, observant nature meant she had listened for 22 years as Daniel discussed every deal, every strategy, every mistake at the dinner table. She knew the business better than anyone. Her first act was to formally rename the company. It was no longer the Peterson Development Group. It became the Irvine Legacy Group, in honor of the man whose foresight had made it all possible. She implemented a new charitable foundation, a real one that focused on building affordable housing and community centers in underserved neighborhoods, a dream she had once shared with a younger, less arrogant Daniel. She sold the ostentatious mansion and moved into a tasteful, comfortable penthouse apartment downtown. She reconnected with her son, Kevin, who was in college and who had been torn between his parents. For the first time, she was able to explain the full story to him, and he finally understood the quiet strength his mother had possessed all along. Jessica was rarely seen in the society pages. She didn't attend galas or seek the spotlight. She found her joy in her work, in seeing her grandfather's name associated with positive growth, and in the quiet evenings spent reading a book, a cup of tea in her hand, finally at peace. She had not just reclaimed her fortune, she had reclaimed her identity, her history, and her future. She was no longer just the foundation. She was the architect, the builder, and the owner standing on ground that was and always had been rightfully hers. 2 years passed. The city's memory, often fleeting, held on to the story of the Peterson divorce with a tenacious grip. It had become a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties, and a case study in law schools. The dramatic collapse in the courtroom was the story's unforgettable climax, but the true narrative, the one that mattered, was written in the quiet, deliberate days that followed. Jessica Peterson, now universally known by her reclaimed name, Jessica Irvine, did not retreat into a life of quiet luxury, as many had expected. She did the opposite. She went to work. The corner office on the 50th floor of the Irvine Legacy Group Tower, once Daniel's throne room, was transformed. The dark mahogany and black leather were replaced with light woods, warm fabrics, and large architectural renderings of her new projects. The most prominent space on her wall, once occupied by a self-aggrandizing portrait of Daniel, now held a simple framed black and white photograph of her grandfather Bill Irvine, standing proudly on the foundation of his first construction project. Her leadership was the antithesis of Daniel's. He had ruled through charisma, intimidation, and high-risk flashy deals that made for great headlines. Jessica managed with a quiet, methodical precision. She listened more than she spoke. She read every line of every contract, her understanding of the business's bones proving to be far more profound than Daniel's ever was. She discovered he had been running the company on a knife's edge, leveraging assets to their breaking point to fund an extravagant lifestyle and chase ever grander projects. Jessica spent the first year stabilizing the company, shoring up its foundations, and earning the trust of employees who were initially wary of the housewife who had staged a corporate coup. Today, she was not in her office. She was standing on a muddy patch of ground in a part of the city Daniel would have never visited unless he was flying over it. Before her stood the newly completed Irvine House, the first project of her new foundation. It wasn't a skyscraper, but a beautifully designed 4-story building that would provide affordable housing and a community support center for low-income families and single parents. Her son Kevin, now a senior in college studying urban planning, stood beside her. The strain that had defined their relationship during the divorce had vanished, replaced by a deep, quiet admiration. He watched his mother as she spoke with the project manager, pointing to the solar panels on the roof and discussing the installation of the playground equipment. "He never would have built this," Kevin said, his voice low. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "Dad, I mean. He would have bought this whole block, torn it down, and put up luxury condos no one from around here could afford." Jessica turned to him, a soft smile on her face. "Your father was good at building things that reached for the sky, Kevin. I'm just more interested in building things with strong roots in the ground." Her phone buzzed. It was a news alert from a local business journal. The headline read, "Daniel Peterson's Phoenix Consulting fails to rise from the ashes." She tapped the link. The short article detailed how Daniel's new one-man consulting firm had officially filed for bankruptcy. It was a pathetic final postscript to his once great career. Daniel Peterson's fall had been as swift as it was brutal. He had lost more than his money. He had lost his identity. For a man whose entire sense of self was built on the admiration and envy of others, obscurity was a fate worse than death. He had tried to leverage his old name, but the name Peterson was now synonymous with hubris and spectacular failure. Potential partners and investors would take his meetings out of morbid curiosity, listen to his grandiose pitches for a comeback, and then politely decline their excuses, barely concealing their amusement. He now lived in a small, generic apartment, an hour outside the city. The Zegna suits were gone, replaced by off-the-rack department store brands that never seemed to fit his deflated frame. He had aged a decade. In 2 years, the confident swagger replaced by a bitter, resentful stoop. He spent his days drafting angry emails to journalists who had slighted him and nursing grievances against a world he felt had conspired to rob him of his kingdom. He never once acknowledged that he had been the architect of his own demise. In the shattered narrative of his life, he was the tragic hero, and Jessica was the villain. Amber Calloway's fate was a different kind of tragedy. After her dramatic exit from Daniel's life, she had tried to maintain her position in the city's social strata, but she was a pariah. The women who had once envied her now shunned her, seeing her as a walking cautionary tale. The men who had once flirted with her now saw her as tainted a liability. Her one remaining asset was the 8-carat canary diamond. When her funds ran low, she took it to the private jeweler where she and Daniel had so triumphantly selected it. She expected a sum that would keep her afloat for years. The jeweler, a man with no sentimentality, explained the harsh reality of the market. A diamond's retail price was an illusion, a story sold to lovers. Its resale value, especially for a stone so recognizable from a famous scandal, was less than a third of what Daniel had paid. She sold it the cash, a bitter substitute for the victory it had once represented. The money was gone within a year, spent on rent for an apartment she couldn't afford, and a wardrobe she had no one to wear for. The last anyone had heard, she had moved back to her hometown. Her vibrant blonde hair returned to its natural brown. She was working as a receptionist at a dental office. The cruel sparkle of her former life just a story she would sometimes tell, and that fewer and fewer people believed. Later that evening, back in her penthouse, Jessica sat by the window, the city lights spread out before her like a blanket of scattered jewels. She was looking over a proposal for a new green energy initiative when an email arrived. The sender's name made her pause. Daniel Peterson. It was the first time he had contacted her directly in over a year. Curiosity, a final ghost of their shared past, compelled her to open it. The email was long and rambling, a pathetic monument to his complete lack of self-awareness. It wasn't an apology. It was a proposition. Jessit began the informal address, a jarring attempt at a connection that no longer existed. I was thinking about the early days, the little apartment on Elm Street. We had nothing but a dream, but it was our dream. I know things ended badly, but what we built together, it was legendary. That vision, the one we shared, is still in the DNA of that company. You've done a good job stabilizing it, I'll admit. But you don't have the fire, the vision, to take it to the next level. I do. I always did. What you have now is because of the foundation I laid. What if we combined our strengths again? You handle the management, the boring stuff you were always good at. Let me come back as a consultant, a strategist. Let me be the visionary again. Together we could truly be unstoppable. We could show them all what the Peterson name really means. Jessica read the email twice. She felt a profound sense of pity, not for the man he was now, but for the man he might have been. He still didn't get it. He called it the Peterson name when it was Irvine money. He called her work boring stuff when it was the very substance of their success. He saw her as a manager of his dream, still unable to grasp that she was the owner of her own reality. He hadn't changed. He was incapable of it. He was a ghost, haunting the ruins of a palace he thought he had built, rattling chains he himself had forged. She moved her cursor to the reply button and held it there for a second. What could she say? What words could possibly penetrate a fortress of ego so complete? She realized in that moment that there were none. Her silence in the courtroom had been her most powerful statement, and her silence now would be her final act of freedom. She moved the cursor away from reply and clicked delete. The email vanished. Jessica stood up and walked out onto her balcony. The cool night air washed over her. She looked out at the skyline, at the towers Daniel had built, their lights twinkling in the darkness. She no longer felt the sting of his betrayal when she looked at them. She felt the weight of her responsibility. They were part of her legacy, now her grandfather's legacy. Her work was not to erase the past, but to build a better future upon it. She had won the war, but more importantly, she had finally and completely won the peace. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story of quiet strength and hidden truths. The tale of Jessica Peterson is a powerful reminder that the loudest person in the room is not always the most powerful. For 22 years, she was underestimated, dismissed, and ultimately betrayed. But she never forgot her own value or the legacy she came from. Her silent, meticulous planning in the face of public humiliation shows that true justice isn't always about shouting. Sometimes it's about knowing which document to keep safe and when to reveal it. This story is for anyone who has ever been made to feel small, for anyone whose contributions have been erased. It proves that the truth, no matter how long it's been buried, has a way of coming to light. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas and inspiring stories. Click the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for listening.